The Eastern Front is going to collapse if 33% of the Ukrainian army is deployed in the general area of Kursk, right? If 33%, one third of the Ukrainian army, which was barely holding on along the Eastern Front before the Kursk offensive, has now taken 33% of its army and deployed it in an area that's far away from the Eastern Front, the Eastern Front is doomed, and that matters enormously. And furthermore, the idea that this 33% of the Ukrainian army that's now going to launch an offensive into Russia is going to score a stunning victory, and the Russians are therefore going to come to the negotiating table, is not a serious argument. They are going to launch an offensive without air superiority, without air cover, to put it bluntly. And they're going to be out in the open, as I said before, and the Russians are going to cut them to doll rags. This is just not going to work. And if you look at what has been happening since August 6th in the Kursk region, the Russians have inflicted massive casualties on the Ukrainian armored forces, and they've killed large numbers of Ukrainian soldiers. And to begin with, the Ukrainians did not have a very large reserve of armored vehicles, and they're certainly desperate on the manpower front. So I don't understand how this works. I don't understand how the Ukrainians shift the military balance in their favor and therefore are well positioned to negotiate their way out of this war.
So you see what at least the alleged plan is that they're going to take this bridgehead they started in the Kursk area and then now start a new one to the west of that, and then a third one to the south to try and bring this entire area, which is relatively large, if they were able to pull this off, while the Russia is still trying to bring in some reserves. I'm going to speak about that part in just a second, about what the Russians are doing as a result. But I think that there is some plausibility that they can at least make some kind of temporary incursion into this and possibly even succeed in occupying some territory. But here's the big problem with just this part, and I'm only going to talk about the northern part here for a second, is the sustainment. How do you sustain this and keep the flanks open and keep the support coming in? Because as you just pointed out, there's a large number of both equipment, vehicles, and personnel that they're sacrificing here. And I just don't know how much more that they had to keep these things going on. So aside from whatever you may want to cause later on, I don't know how they maintain this one.
I don't either. I mean, again, let's go back to the period before August 6th. Virtually everyone agreed that the Ukrainians were desperate for manpower. They were having great difficulty replacing the losses in the battles on the Eastern Front with the Russians. And now all of a sudden we're hearing that they have all of these forces that can be deployed not only to fight on the Eastern Front, but to launch new offensives into Russia proper. How can this be? Where did these forces come from? And then when you read about the Kursk offensive, the one that started on August 6th, it seems clear from almost all the reports on both sides, the Western/Ukrainian side and on the Russian side, that the Ukrainians cobbled together all the available forces that they could scrounge up to fight this war in the Kursk region. But now we're being told that they still have many more forces left that will enable them to launch even more offensives. And they'll be able to sustain the offensive in the Kursk region, which is devouring lots of manpower. And they'll be able to hold on in the Pokrovsk area on the Eastern Front. Remember, Zelensky said the situation is improving there. This all fails the common sense test, right? The whole discourse about the war in Ukraine, in the West and in Ukraine itself, bears little resemblance to reality. I just, find it hard to believe that people are making these arguments about.
Now, part of the answer to one of the things you said about where did the troops come from, I've noticed over the last couple of months that there have been reports that Russia had been massing some forces around the Sumy area, and that they had commensurate responses of the Ukraine side to move some mobile troops in the south there in anticipation of an attack into the Sumy area from Russia. And so it appears that Ukraine took the opportunity to make it look like they were preparing defensive troops when actually they were mobilizing offensive potential. So that apparently did catch Russia by some surprise, though I have heard some reports that the Russians possibly thinking along the same lines that you did, say that they were aware of that and were okay with that because it could potentially end the war quicker if they destroy these troops coming out before that. But one of the objectives, at least it was stated by numerous people in terms of what Ukraine wanted to accomplish here in support of the Pokrovsk area, was that they wanted Russia to withdraw some troops from the Eastern Front up into here to relieve pressure on that. But as Scott, one of the few good ones this morning, actually, analysis on Sky News this morning told that that's not how it's working out. Watch this.
Well, first of all, it's important to understand that the narrative which says that Putin is concentrating on what's going on the Eastern Front at this point in time, and he's kind of written off what's going on in Kursk, and he'll deal with that later, is wrongheaded. There's no question that the Russians are wisely not removing large numbers of troops from the Eastern Front and moving to the Kursk region. So that is all for the positive from the Russian point of view, all for the good from the Russian point of view. But the Russians are dealing at the moment with the Kursk offensive. Basically, what they have done is contained it. They have troops around this salient. They've contained it. And while the Ukrainians are trying to extend the size of the territory that they have conquered by launching offensives, the Russians are taking aim at those offensive Ukrainian forces and destroying them in large numbers. So the casualty numbers on the Ukrainian side are estimated to be around 4,000. They went in with a force of about 10, maybe 12,000 troops. There were about 10 to 12,000 troops at the peak deployed inside of the Kursk salient, as best I could tell. And it looks like about 4,000 of them have already been casualties. Huge numbers of armored vehicles and artillery pieces on the Ukrainian side have been destroyed. So the Russians are tearing apart those forces, those Ukrainian forces that are inside the Kursk salient. It's not like the Russians are just letting the Ukrainians run wild in the streets. They're containing them. Of course, they will eventually have to reduce this salient once those troops that Putin is talking about mobilizing are brought to bear. But that can wait for another day. Well, the question, Danny, is what do you think the Chinese could potentially do to improve Russia's situation? In other words, what do the Russians need that the Chinese can give them? I don't see much there. It's not like the Russians are short of aircraft, short of artillery, and the Chinese are certainly not going to provide manpower. It may be that the Russians need more chips, and the Chinese can give them chips or some other form of sophisticated technology. But my guess would be that they're already giving them those sorts of items if the Russians need them, because it's easy to do that surreptitiously. So I don't think that the Russians need that much from the Chinese at this point of time, except for diplomatic support, and they are getting diplomatic support. So that's
and I guess also with the fact that Iran and North Korea are giving direct military assistance, potentially China could help with that too, I suppose. Again, surreptitious, as you say. But do you see any concern, especially given this big BRICS meeting that's coming in October, that we're seeing that things continue to shift globally in a direction that strengthens the Russia-Ukraine and their allied side against the West?
There's no question about that. And it's not just the Ukraine war that's doing that. One could argue it's more due to the Gaza genocide. The fact is that given the fact that the United States is complicitous in this genocide and is supporting Israel at every turn and has shown little interest in upholding international law in the process. Countries all around the world are disgusted with the United States. They're angry at the United States. So the Gaza genocide, coupled with what's happening in Ukraine, have done enormous damage to our reputation around the world.
And to what extent might the Chinese side, or maybe a better question, how do you think it might impact the Chinese in terms of what they're going to do and what kind of foreign policy they may have when they see that the West, in its confrontation with Ukraine, has not only given authorization to use weapons and ammunition against Russia, but now have either tacitly or overtly given them permission to actually attack into the territory of Russia? Might they see any concerns in a potential future Taiwan-China engagement that we might try to do the same thing into Chinese territory?
Well, I think most people understand that if push comes to shove, the United States will defend Taiwan. And one could argue that from a Chinese point of view, if you look at how deeply committed the United States is to defending or helping to defend Ukraine, the lengths that we've gone to keep Ukraine in the fight, it would seem that one should assume from the Chinese perspective that the United States would do the same with regard to Taiwan. So I would imagine the Chinese, looking at what's happening in Ukraine, would think that they're not going to get a free pass on Taiwan, that they're going to have to deal with the Americans and other allies of the United States in East Asia if they were to get into a war over Taiwan.
And on the one hand, that could seem to deter China from doing something, but could there be any negative side of that it might get them to act more aggressively directly against the United States or their interests? How might that play out?
Well, I think it's more likely that that scenario will take place in the South China Sea. I think the more dangerous of the two places, here we're talking about Taiwan versus the South China Sea. I think the South China Sea is the more dangerous place. And there's a real danger that the Filipinos and the Chinese will get dragged into a conflict over these islets or shoals that the two countries both believe belong to them. And if a conflict were to break out between the Philippines and China, the United States would likely get dragged in on the side of the Philippines. I think there's a real possibility of conflict there. So I think the South China Sea is where we could have trouble. And in that scenario, one can imagine the Chinese thinking that the Americans are pinned down in the Middle East and they're pinned down in Europe. And here we're talking about Ukraine. And therefore, we have an opportunity to take advantage of the Philippines in the South China Sea because the Americans have taken their eye off the ball. If you've seen any of these charts that depict American naval deployments into the greater Middle East, because of the threat of an Iranian attack on Israel, it's really quite amazing how many naval assets we have in the greater Middle East. And some of those naval assets have been swung out of East Asia. So one could argue that given that we're not really pivoting to Asia as much as we should be, if you're bent on containing China, that there may be an opportunity for the Chinese to take advantage of the United States in the South China Sea. But I don't think that's true over Taiwan. I don't think there's going to be any trouble over Taiwan or any conflict over Taiwan in the foreseeable future. I'm not saying that's 100% certain, but I think it's highly unlikely. South China Sea is a different matter. And you do want to appreciate the fact that we are so deeply involved in the Middle East and in Ukraine that we do not have that much time to spend thinking about deterrence and containment in East Asia.
Since you mentioned the Middle East here in the last few minutes that we have, I wonder if you could just kind of give your assessment of what situation is in the Middle East, because on the one hand, you have the U.S. at least ostensibly trying to seek a negotiated settlement or at least a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, but there's also concurrent signs that in Newsweek last week, for example, the senior Israeli official gave a public interview that said that they view a war with Iran as inevitable and wanted the United States to get involved quickly. And there's also evidence that they're thinking about going into southern Lebanon against Hezbollah so that things could wide open. All the while, we're waiting to find out if Iran is going to retaliate or how they're going to retaliate against Israel for what happened in Tehran with the assassination of Haniyeh. How do you see all this playing out here in the near term, and what are your concerns about the U.S. interests?
Well, in terms of how this is playing out and is likely to play out, the war in Gaza has not ended. The Israelis are still deeply involved in Gaza. They're still killing Palestinians in large numbers. And all this talk about a ceasefire seems to be empty rhetoric. Tony Blinken is constantly saying the Israelis agree to the ceasefire deal that we Americans are pushing forward. And then Benjamin Netanyahu makes it clear that he's agreed to no such deal. So it doesn't look like the war in Gaza is going to be shut down. With regard to the conflict with Hezbollah, if anything, that's escalating these days. And as long as the war in Gaza continues, the war with Hezbollah, or the war between Hezbollah and Israel, will continue. And then there's Iran, as you were mentioning, and the Iranians have promised that they're going to attack Israel in retaliation for the July 31st murder of Haniyeh in Tehran, but they have not retaliated. So it's an open question when that will happen or if it will happen. But in the meantime, relations between Iran and Israel and Iran and the United States are terrible. And one can imagine those terrible relations leading to a conflict involving all three of those powers. So we are still in deep trouble in the Middle East, we meaning the United States, because we're in the middle of this, simply because we're joined at the hip with Israel. And I don't see us getting out of this mess anytime soon. We're not going to end the trouble with the Palestinians. We're not going to end the trouble with Hamas, with Hezbollah, and we're not going to end the trouble with Iran. These problems are going to go on and on and on. And as I said a few minutes ago, this has negative consequences for our position in East Asia. For those of us who believe that China is the single most important threat to the United States, the fact that we're not able to, pivot to Asia in a meaningful way, and we're not able to focus on containing China, and we're instead consumed with dealing with the Russians in Ukraine and supporting the Israelis in the Middle East is not good news.